Damos paso.
Well, let's move on to the question and answer session. Firstly, I'm going to hand the floor to the former members or current members of the European Parliament, and if we have time, we'll then hand the floor to the students if they wish to speak. Now, I'd like to ask you to follow the rules of the European Parliament when you're posing questions. What that means is you can ask a question perfectly well in 1 minute, and you have to indicate who your question is for. So let's begin. Firstly, Ursula Braun-Messer. There she is. Then, after that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Köhler talked about the distinction between refugees and immigrants. Well, in fact, this is quite the problem. A lot of people are arguing about asylum status instead of immigration. Asylum gives people a shelter for the period while the war is over, until the war is over. But in fact, asylum gives people the right to stay along with their family members in Germany. What that means is that some tens of thousands per day are coming into our countries. I think there has to be a distinction between the asylum seekers and the immigrants that are coming in. What we see is that people are going to be coming in right up until Christmas and even for the coming year, receiving social support and money, not to mention getting into the employment market with €8.50 minimum wage. That's something that they could certainly not get if you, for example, if you're trying to be a gardener and you don't know anything about gardening, or if you're trying to be a cleaning lady and you're breaking things because you don't know how to do it. I think it's important to stick together in Europe. Germany has shown itself to be willing to help, to provide support, but in many cases support for authoritarian regimes which have received the support. This concept of asylum, should it not be improved? That's my question.
Mr. McGowan, followed by Mr. Jassili, please.
Before our colleague from the Commission leaves, could I mention that there are substantial resources in various budget lines of the European Union. I was in Luxembourg 2 weeks ago, and the Court of Auditors are making a recommendation to the Commission to be flexible so that some of these resources can be made available so we can provide dignified reception areas. And I think this meeting is taking place within days, and I would like your comment on that. But it also relates to another thing that we can do as far as the European Union is concerned, and this applies to both the UNHCR and IOM. The bombardment, aerial bombardment from EU countries on Syria is escalating. It's being proposed to escalate, and I'd be interested to know to what extent you feel this is an increasing problem as far as increasing the number of displaced persons. But I've kept that brief because I'd like a quick response from our colleague from the Commission.
Dado que se trata de una pregunta muy...
Well, this is a very clear question. The first one was anyway. The second one's much more wide-ranging. So perhaps I could ask for an answer which contains clear information.
I think, in a way, Elmar Brok anticipated the reply, because when speaking about Zeitenwende, turning the page, turning the kind of into a new logic, he also said that this is a problem that's not going to go away. So, in other words, we have to completely rethink and reshuffle all our instruments, including financial instruments. The central problem that we had over the past years in replying to the refugee crisis was that either we were not able to find a budgetary response, or we did it on an ad hoc basis. Now, this is already a problem if you do it inside the European Union. It's even more a problem if you have a situation, just as Mr. Brok illustrated it, where you have people in camps. Now, Migration specialists will tell you, and we have some eminent specialists here on the panel, that on average, in a migration situation, I'm speaking here about refugees, to be more precise, refugees stay in their host country for 17 years, 1-7. So this is the worldwide average. In other words, if you have situations such as Eritrea, such as Syria, such as Iraq, it is kind of common knowledge that we need to have a response that takes a long time. That needs to be kind of almost continuous and permanent. And that means in our budget, we need to have a perspective. We don't need to have a situation, or we must not have a situation, where you give us on an ad hoc basis some money for 2015, and then we go into 16 and basically are trying to beg around to get some additional money, and by the end of 2016 we get another 200 million here or so, or another 50 million there, and then in 17 the same thing. What you need to have is kind of a predictability of what we can get. This is true for migration funding, this is true for funding of international organizations, this is true also for the funding, for example, of creating livelihoods structures, including infrastructure in the camps. And that is the problem. I think the EU, and that, in that respect I mean both the Commission, Council and also Parliament, obviously, are only now waking up to this reality. And it is indeed true that, although I'm not the ultimate specialist of the intricacies of the EU budget, that there seem to be hidden reserves. Give you one example. In July, I was still told that, unfortunately, there's no more money left. No more money left to cope with the refugee crisis. Looking at the margins of heading 4 and so forth. Then the migration crisis became one in a way. So, as we said earlier, it moved on from a refugee to a migration crisis touching the European Union more directly. All of a sudden, our political leaders on the 27th of September, when coming together for the informal meeting in European Council format, mobilized another 200 million euros for ECHO and 300 million euros for the European Neighbourhood Instrument to be spent in 2015, so within 4 months, in order to cope with this new reality. So I was flabbergasted to see that all of a sudden we were able to find €500 million that I didn't have any knowledge of before. So in other words, probably I should speak much more often with the Budget Committee of the European Parliament. There seem to be kind of hidden treasures here and there that can be activated, but what it takes in order to do so is, and that I think Mr. Brok pointed out beautifully, it needs first political will, and secondly it requires a common recognition that we are facing a new structural reality that requires structural long-term responses.
Thank you.
Could I just add that you can decide?
No, please.
You can decide this
you
next
don't have
week.
the floor.
You can decide
Michael,
this next week.
You have taken 5 minutes.
It's not a long-term thing.
Please, le doy la palabra al señor Jassili.
Mr. Jassili, you have the floor.
Seguido de Mónica Baldi.
Followed by Monica Valdi, and please, be succinct.
Haga el favor de responder.
Ma'am, please, we have a speakers list. Mr. Vassili has the floor. Could we have a microphone for the speaker, please?
Je voudrais vous rappeler que...
Thank you. Well, let me recall that I was here between 1994 and 1999, and during that period there was a war going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was an opinion written on the funding of the reconstruction after that war, and I was the rapporteur for it, and so I know what I'm talking about. I went there and I worked with Jacques Chirac when he was deciding on bombing the Serbian opposition after the Halifax summit. So we all know how these things work. 200,000 people died during that war in Europe. 1 million people were injured. Tens of thousands of people left. I've written a book on it. Bosnia was killed 3 times. Firstly with the physical dead, secondly with the physically handicapped who are now have to be looked after by other people, and a third time because all these people who were 22, 23, 24, 25 left and they went to Australian, Canadian, American universities. They basically went to finish their studies in those countries and they're never going to go back. So the country was deprived of its elites, and the same thing's happening in Syria. I've done something that no one else here has done. In 2001, I stopped being involved in politics, and I went to live in Turkey. I went to Turkey because I'd been the rapporteur on the customs union, and I wanted to go and see how things were going in Turkey and what the results were. I mean, Turkey today is the victory of Ibn al-Saud over Kemal Ataturk. It's a posthumous victory. And let me tell you what awaits us. I mean, the situation is going to be a tough one, and it's not only to do with migrants. We're talking about war here because we have Bosnia multiplied 100 times. And if you haven't understood that, you're going to struggle to deal with the situation. Thank you, Monica Valdi, followed by Starkovic.
Pardon, non trovavo il bottone.
Sorry, I couldn't find the button. Thank you. So let me thank you for this event, because it's really important to reflect on migration at the moment. I'm from Italy. I'm Monica Baldi, and I'd like to thank Mr. Brok as well, because his analysis of international politics has really given us an insight into some of the elements that I think we have to look at very carefully, I believe. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank him because he recalled Lampedusa. Just a year ago, Italy was alone in trying to understand what was going on. I mean, Greece had to deal with its own migration problem, but Italy was trying to deal with its migration problem on its own. But I think it's, at this time, given the fear that exists in Europe and elsewhere with regard to terrorism, we need to have intelligence cooperation. That is key at this current time. I mean, this is important when it comes to both foreign policy and internal policy, because the exchange of information is really key when it comes to many issues that we're dealing with now. So let me move on to the questions, and I have various questions for the speakers. Firstly, in Italy, we had a lot of problems with identification. You mentioned hot spots, so with regard to Italy and Greece. We had problems also because we were sticking to the Dublin III rules, and the issue of identification was key there. Many migrants didn't want to be identified because they wanted to move on to another European state. So, I mean, you'll understand the difficulties that our police faced. So that's one of the issues that I want to bring up. I mean, identification in Italy often lasted months, and that's a major problem when it comes to dealing with this issue. So how can we deal with that? A further question that I believe is extremely important, it's just been mentioned, relates to training and education. I mean, there are currently programs for the educational needs, also of educators who are involved in programs to insert these migrants into society. But what's important is to recognize the skills of these migrants as well. We often have qualified people who are migrants, doctors, etc. So training, the use of digital technologies, recognition of their skills. That's a second question that I wanted to raise. And then final question, I think we need a package of programs and actions that not only come from the European Union, but also from other agencies such as the Arab League, the African Union and the UN as well, because we need dialogue between all these institutions, and we need to understand what they're all doing, because it's only by doing that that we can come up with a proper joint programme, because there are 60 million refugees right across the world, as has been said. Thank you. Mr. Brok had to go, alas, because he's been called to speak in plenary. But I think he did his duty by us. Our colleague Starkovic, Margarita, Mrs. Starkovic, is she there?
It's obvious that European Union is bullied by different countries to squeeze money. So my question is does somebody have plans to change EU foreign policy and especially spending for external aid policy instead of current spending through the agencies which are here present to support refugees, for example, putting forward commitment in the trade agreements to create social security network in those countries from where refugees are coming, or the third world countries allocating part of money from the European Union funds.
Yo, doy la palabra a Peter Price.
Peter Price now, followed by our colleague Dahan.
We've heard a masterful summary of what the situation is at the moment and some hopes of how we might be able to deal with it, but I wonder really whether we've even now become realistic enough about the challenges which we face. And I have two issues that I want to question. The first is the possibility of returning those people who are found not to come under the heading of refugees. That those people, is it realistic, for example, to return them to Syria in its current situation? Is it realistic, given the sort of numbers, that we are going to be able to return people? That's my first question. The second is, if one looks at the scale of the push factors and the number of countries where they exist, and then the continuing pull factors that have been described, including the knowledge of what exists in Europe, aren't we going to be faced long-term with an enormous flow? And I say this not from the populist kind of perspective at all, but from the perspective of how do we realistically, rather than in any other way, deal with this. And I'm concerned that if we give a false picture, it rebounds. It's an opportunity for the populists in the end.
Thank you, Peter. Dejan, no le veo. Ya, se marchó. Beaupuy tiene la palabra.
Beaupuy, followed by Karen Juncker.
Oui. Il est facile en théorie de parler.
Well, in theory, it's easy to talk about environmental refugees and distinguish them from political refugees, and then distinguish them from economic refugees. I mean, theoretically, that's easy and possible, but I'd actually like our experts to tell us how we can actually do that.
Juncker.
Karen Juncker, now, followed by Malika Benaravatov.
Ja.
Luis Versteck.
Ich möchte zwei Dinge.
Well, there are 2 points that I'd like to address. Firstly, unfortunately, Mr. Brock's not here anymore, but he talked about the Turkey deal and the financial possibilities that we have to dry out the IS financially. Now, I'd like to know whether or not there is a specific arrangement in place with Turkey and the monies to tackle the problem of the Hasidic women that are being put on the market, so to speak, and then bought up. We've seen reports on German TV done with hidden cameras where basically these women are transferred through Turkey to Europe, people smuggling basically. These are criminal activities that have to be stopped, but they still give IS a huge amount of money in their coffers. Another issue that I'd like to mention has already been brought up. I work in Germany with the immigrants that come to my country. In my town, we get some 500 migrants every week coming in on the train. Now, a lot of the immigrants are coming from the West Balkans, and it doesn't help now that they're being called safe third countries, because people aren't coming to us because they're fearful for their lives. They're actually coming to us because they are worried that there is corruption and money laundering and so on going on in those countries, organised crime, youth unemployment in those countries as well. I put this all in a report I drafted on this myself. I think it's not enough to come to an agreement with Turkey. That's the one point. But the other issue is, when it comes to the Western Balkan countries, we have to have very specific negotiations with them to look at how we can stabilise the situation. And we need to have the right resources in place to do that, to try to develop some prospects for the people who live in those countries, politically but also economically. If they can't make progress, if they're left by the wayside, or if they're allowed to fester in political instability, then we'll get a situation coming up time and time again where these people simply try to look for a future in Europe because they don't have one back home. What that means is that, for example, a lot of the citizens of Macedonia, young people particularly, come in as if they were refugees from war. This has been mentioned. They come through Croatia and they try to get into the legal European employment markets. But the same doesn't really apply to Kosovo, for example. So I think there is a grey area that needs to be clarified. We need to do something, because in the long term we're not going to sort this out anytime soon. Instead, we're going to talk about people restoring the borders and so on.
Le doy la palabra a Malika Arab, seguida de
Malika Abel Arab, followed by Charles Ferdinand Auton.
Si, Monsieur le Président.
I'm here. Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, we're talking about the Mediterranean region, but we haven't at all discussed the Euromed project, and I'm struck by that, and the reason for that is because the project's been abandoned. I mean, we had the Barcelona process that launched this project, and that was really a dynamic project, and I think it was a political error to abandon that. So I want to know how we can relaunch that project. I mean, it's a shame that some of the speakers have left. I mean, you have young people from southern countries who are ready to give up their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean, and when you see that, you realise that this isn't just an economic issue. It's because they're not being offered an attractive life, basically, and that's true of southern people, but it's also true of people for the north. I mean, what can we offer young people nowadays, whether they come from the north or the south? There's a point that was raised by a colleague earlier, and I think that's extremely important, and that relates to the possibility of having a Mediterranean social welfare programme. I mean, that's a great idea. Why not do that? In France, after the Second World War, there was nothing. The country was destroyed. There was no money available. Countless dead. And in spite of that, the speakers are being interrupted and being asked to be brief. In spite of a lack of resources, social welfare was established in 1945, and that enabled a redistribution of wealth and meant that people could imagine a decent future. So that's a question that I would raise. Mr. Kohler's left, but why not launch some kind of Mediterranean welfare programme? Thank you. Thank you very much. Charles Ferdinand Noton.
Le Président, merci.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Brock distinguished between the different causes of migration. Obviously, you have to look at the causes to be able to deal with the issue. They were refugees as a result of war and insecurity, and they were distinguished from migrants who are pushed by poverty, a lack of perspectives, and the call of modernity. Mrs. Thompson, you're still there, so I'll ask you the question. Can you give us an idea of the approximate proportions of refugees who migrate as a result of insecurity and who could perhaps go back home if their country of origin was made more secure, and distinguish those from economic migrants, as it were. For example, poor farmers who come from poor regions and who also cause food problems because, or come from areas where there's no food. I'd like to have some figures there, because, or some idea, because that would help us when it comes to Mediterranean policies. Thank you very much, Charles. Yorgos Chavos now, followed by Edith Herzog.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, most of the questions were going to Elmar Brok, because I think he has provoked, with his masterly geopolitical round, has provoked several issues, and also has put, I think, the finger in what goes on, wrong in Europe. And I think he repeated at the very beginning that is now a moment of make it or break it. And I'm not sure all the Europeans understand that, because some might think still we're in the business, probably as usual, we might have some more summits, and then we might solve the problems. But my question addressed to him, and probably to you, since there's no other parliamentarian there, it would be what it would take right now for Europe to stop the internal fragmentation, therefore which obviously needs transfer of powers or a European level for work for the matters like migration and especially the refugee issue, and as well as what we can do in foreign policy and defense, which still Europe is absent and is highly fragmented, its presence in this area. Elmar Brok stated that this is a 30 years war, and I think I like this parallelism, but the 30 years war ended up with a very important achievement, which is the Westphalian Treaty. That is an important achievement of that period. Otherwise, peace wouldn't exist. Right now, I think, is the high moment, when this huge reconfiguration of power, and there is need to come to a certain arrangement of this time of polity, which cannot be anything else but a federal Europe, having clear powers, not only in the financial and monetary field, but especially in foreign power, defense, and internal powers. My question would be mostly now, since Elmar is not there, to Mrs. Laura Thompson, which I think it was quite fascinating a debate, the point that how we turn the threats into an opportunity. And that's something I think should be more widely debated, not only here in Brussels, but around its capitals. It's a very important message. And I'd like to ask you again, what would be your key argument for defending this, I think, very important and penetrating suggestion?
Well, thank you, Yorgos. The current situation of overcoming the Treaty of Westphalia is the Treaty of Lisbon. We must see if we are up to the task. This is a good question. Edith Herzog, seguida de Bertman, y nos queda el señor Mor.
And then we've got Mr. Morlan, and we have another speaker on the list as well. And then I wanted to give the floor to the students, but I would ask them to just speak very briefly, so that perhaps a few of them can speak. Edith Herzog, please.
Actually, I am happy because the previous speakers partially raised the question I would have, and I'm also lucky because my question can go to all of the speakers. My question is about Europe. I think that to face the migrant cases, we have to be sure what are we standing for. Coming from the country called Hungary, which I had to leave, actually, because it's very difficult to live in a democracy of that kind, it seems that Europe has a crossroad to take. Are we able to keeping our values and principles together, to keeping the European Union as it is? And if not, then what we are going to do? Are we making a huge compromise on our values, or are we making huge compromise on the European Union as we know it today? And I tell it again, as a Hungarian socialist, standing for the values mostly common in that room, but it's not common within the existing territory of the European Union, and unfortunately we do not have a speaker from the region to face, by those colleagues who are sitting here, the different narrative which is actually spreading and making very toxic all the European Union coming from East. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Good statement. Wertmann, seguido por Morland.
Colleague Wertmann, followed by our colleague Morland.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure my questions could be answered by any of the experts. I'm a very big friend of the Schengen Agreement, but if you look at the fact that more than 100 people smugglers were caught in one evening going across the border between Germany and Austria, would it not be possible to improve our tackling of the human being smugglers by closing the border temporarily and then to try to sort it out from there? I know that Austria had a problem where a lot of refugees were coming from Hungary across the border, and the Hungarian authorities were actually involved in helping them along the way. And in doing so, we're in breach of Article 25 of the cooperation treaty that's in place in the police sphere in our countries. Also, it's important to remember that children who are undergoing a refugee procedure don't go to school, whereas in accordance with the law of my country, it's obligatory to go to school for children. My question really is, do refugee children have to go to school or not? Do they have to be given a place in a school? My other question is for Ms. Thompson. You said that refugees are quite often well qualified. In my country, people are saying that the refugees, unfortunately, are very low qualified people, or in fact don't have any qualifications at all in some cases. Could you tell us more information regarding what the situation is in Europe?
Robert Morland, seguido por Ana.
Robert Morland, followed by Anna Caramano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, if I can just follow what the last speaker said, and that's to add to it, and it's not actually my own view, but with a lot of comments about refugees and immigrants taking jobs. I don't actually think it's the real experience, but we do have to recognise that that is something we get from public opinion. And actually, we haven't had very much about how we deal with the problem of public opinion in our member states. If I look at opinion polls in a number of member states, this is a big issue. And it's not always in the direction that you would like it to go. And I'm not sure we know yet how we grapple with it. That is my question. I just wanted to say, Mr. Brok made a reference to my member state in a negative sense. He didn't say what he was referring to. And I won't get into the business of it. But I did object to the link to Christianity. I would not use that as a criticism of my government.
Tiene la palabra Ana Caramano y...
Anna Caramano now, and then our colleague Karas.
Thank you. I'm Anna Caramano from Greece, but my question has to do with women's potential, women refugees and women immigrants. And I would like to ask whether the EU, the European Commission, has special programs towards women's rights, which are violently violated within these groups, these immigrant refugees flows. We know that these flows usually come from countries where women's rights are not respected, and women do not enjoy even fundamental rights and freedoms. I was very happy to hear that Europe is intending of exploiting the potential of these immigrant refugees flows and make use of these force. Well, my questions go to women. In which ways and which means Europe is going to benefit from this unexploited potential that women, refugees and immigrants express. And I would like to say that women's organization in Greece showed great solidarity and compassion towards the refugees arriving in the Greek islands. Some of them really made sacrifices to save lives and save especially children. You all know what has happened, if refugees arriving with the boats in thousands in the Greek islands. So we expect EU to take a special care. Other colleagues also raised the question on women's rights, women's needs, women's sanitary needs, hygiene needs, and also the children. Thank you.
Right, Anna. Tiene la palabra Kars, seguido por...
Our colleague Kars, followed by Pauka Saukila.
President, you answered my question already. My question was, if a time had not arrived to get the younger persons present the chance to get in and give their views on the problems we are discussing.
I'm in favor, but you have taken 1 minute for the young. Paca Sauquillo, y luego, si no hay más...
Paca Sauquillo, and then if there are no other members of the association who want the floor, I'll give the floor to 3 of our student visitors. Thank you very much, Chairman. Just very briefly. Well, we're discussing refugees, and it seems as if we're putting it as if it were a problem for each individual member state, and I think that's an error. It should be seen as a European problem rather than a problem for individual member states. I mean, in Spain, we don't have that many refugees at the moment because the elections are coming up. But we need to see it as a Europe-wide problem, and we need to solve it because there's going to be human rights problems, a problem of cohesion. There'll be a problem of violence in Europe as well. So we need to deal with this problem jointly. This is the most significant problem that Europe as a whole faces. It's not necessarily a problem that is a problem for each individual member state on its own.
Well,
thank you very much, Paca. Well, if there are no members of the association who wish to take the floor, let me open the floor to the young people who are here with us today. Does anyone want to ask a question? You have the floor.
Parece. Yeah. All the questions were not answered. Thank you. Sí, tiene la palabra.
You have the floor.
Parlo nella mia lingua.
Or let me speak Italian.
Ok. Sì. Allora, niente, io volevo fare comunque un'osservazione.
Okay, well, I did want to make a comment, actually.
Sì.
No, volevo semplicemente sapere.
I just wanted to know whether at the level of migrant crisis management there is currently some kind of check on organizations that are working in favor of migratory flows. Because I know that in Italy, for example, ad hoc associations have been set up and they don't have the appropriate tools and training to properly receive migrants. So, for example, UNHCR, the European Commission, the European Union, is there some kind of training and support program for associations that work to receive migrants? Thank you.
Segunda pregunta.
Second question. Young people, anyone want to take the floor?
Acuerdo con lo que se ha dicho.
You obviously agree with what's been said.
Bien. Bueno, entonces, si no hay más...
Okay. We have no more questions from the seniors or the juniors. So, given that, I'll give our two remaining speakers the floor so that they can answer the questions. Sophie McGuinness first, and then Laura Thompson, and then I'll ask Veronique de Keyser to draw up some conclusions. So, Sophie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for the very interesting questions and all of the comments and the ideas as well that were shared. I'm going to focus on some of the questions that maybe weren't necessarily directed to UNHCR, but I think fall quite neatly within our mandate. One of the last comments that I heard was about the need for European-wide action rather than nation-state action. And I couldn't agree more. The High Commissioner for Refugees has on many times said the refugee problem is not a German problem, it's not an Austrian problem, it is a global problem that the European Union needs to work together on responding. That was one of the reasons behind the Leaders' Summit, because the unilateral actions that were seen up to that point, we could see that if there was a closure of movement from one state to the next, the movement would just move to another country rather than being resolved. So certainly solidarity is what is required, and from a UNHCR point of view as well, we have often said this is not necessarily a crisis of numbers, it's more a crisis of solidarity. And when we look at the countries within the European Union that are hosting the most asylum seekers and refugees, there could be a much fairer distribution, and that's what the relocation measure is aimed at, and that's what resettlement is aimed at. But for those measures to work, we do require member states to work together. And there is a little bit of a conundrum here in that national member states still retain the powers, the sovereignty to control their borders, to manage their asylum policies. And that does happen within the framework of the common European asylum system. However, not all of the member states are fully signed up to all aspects of the common European asylum system, and even those that are have not been applying all of the aspects of the common system together in unison. So we certainly need more supranational action, and I think that has been recognised by member states and indeed by the Commission also. An important illustration of that, perhaps, is that the European Commission has been undertaking assessment missions to countries where asylum seekers and refugees have been arriving recently. And in those assessment missions, the Directorate Generals that deal with the internal issues and the external issues have gone together to visit in the assessment missions. And I think that comes back to the point that another speaker made about the need for flexibility across funding, because I don't think that many parliamentarians would have envisaged a couple of years ago that there would be a need for basic humanitarian interventions on the territory of the European Union, but that is the case these days, and that is going to require us tapping into the expertise of ECHO and DevCo in a DG Home context, and I think those parallels are being made, which is very positive. A further question that was raised by another speaker was this issue of how do you distinguish between people in need of protection and people who may not be in need of protection. This is an important question because one of the things that as UNHCR we're trying to advocate for is the maintenance of the protection space within the European Union, so that people who are in need of protection can access that protection in line with the right to seek and enjoy asylum, which is guaranteed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights and many other core instruments, and is guaranteed in many of the national constitutions of countries within the European Union. How that assessment takes place is already written down in measures adopted by the European Union. We have the Procedures Directive and the Qualifications Directive, which explain how these determinations take place. International protection is composed of two things in the European context: the refugee definition, where somebody is fleeing because of persecution on certain grounds, and the subsidiary protection ground, which is a person who is fleeing their country because of torture, death penalty or indiscriminate violence, which is something that we're seeing more often now. In all of the countries in the European Union, there are legal rules under the common European framework for how that determination should be made. So those rules are in place. The problem is that that system has not responded well to the scale of the current arrivals, but that has to be done. So I think when we're looking at, another question was raised around the Dublin regulation, we understand that the Commission are going to look at that to bring in a Dublin 4 and that that's been accelerated so that we can look at that quicker. But it's a key concern of us from UNHCR that those determinations need to be made in order that people who are in need of protection can access that protection, and that there has to be much more solidarity so that the task of doing that is not simply left to the countries in the south or the countries nearest the places from where people are travelling. So I think that's an important distinction. There was also a question around what proportion of people are in need of protection. The Eurostat maintain statistics from all of the national member states who provide statistics on asylum determination, and that gives what's called a recognition rate, which is the proportion of people in asylum systems who are determined to be in need of protection. It varies in different countries, and that's another problem. You know, recognition rates may vary for rational reasons, for example, if the caseloads are very different, but in principle there should be a more harmonised refugee recognition rate across the European Union. So in some countries there's a recognition rate of 50%, so 50% of all of those who arrive and seek asylum are recognised as being in need of refugee protection or subsidiary protection. In other countries it's a lower recognition rate. I think the average is somewhere around 30%. It's often changeable, so it's important to look at the data in the Eurostat figures. Another indication, I guess, that I can give you is that of the arrivals by sea to Europe up to the 2nd of December, there were over 880,000 arrivals by sea to Europe. And of that over 800,000, 84% of those come from the top 10 refugee-producing countries. The main nationalities were Syria, which were 51%, Afghanistan 20%, Iraq 6%, and Eritrea 4%. So a significant proportion of those arriving by sea are coming from refugee-protecting countries. One of the things that the relocation mechanism was established to do, and this is the mechanism under which 160,000 people, asylum seekers, will be transferred from Greece and Italy to other countries which have a lower number of asylum seekers. That will be open to people who come from countries where the refugee recognition rate within the European Union is higher than 75%. So that's going to bring within its ambit Syrians, for example. So I think those are the kinds of measures that we can try and use in order to ensure that people in need of protection access it, but that they also access it through a solidarity mechanism where the member states who provide that support are a broader range than simply Germany, Austria, Sweden and the other receiving countries. I think it's also important, and perhaps this might be something more for the domain of my colleague from the International Organization for Migration. I think it's also important that we recognise that outside of the protection regime, so refugee protection and subsidiary protection, there are also some people who are travelling who may also have legitimate ways to regularise their status. There may be people who have family reunification entitlements or other entitlements, and those need to be brought into the framework as well. I appreciated the comment as well from the speaker who raised the specific situation of women. I think there's a key challenge at the moment for people on the Western Balkan route, that women and children with particular needs are spending a very, very short time in some of the countries of transit, and we are seeing needs which are not being met. So there are women who are heavily pregnant, there are children who are separated from their families, there are a lot of vulnerabilities when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. There's a lot of work that's going on in the transit countries to try and ensure that families and women and children and separated children are separated in terms of the accommodation from single men who are travelling on the route. But these are ongoing and massive challenges, and we are linking in with our colleagues in UNICEF, in other organisations to try and better address these challenges. But I think the reality is we are not meeting the needs of vulnerable people and women on the routes, and we need to link in much more with local partners, women's organisations, children's organisations in the national member states to try and meet those needs. There was a question around training for people who might be in associations and organisations that are working with refugees and asylum seekers. There is training that is delivered at national level by UNHCR. I know IOM also is involved in a lot of training on the trafficking agenda. So perhaps if you're operational at the national level, you might wish to make contact with the local offices for UNHCR and other actors there. And also at the European level, the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, does a lot of training, including training of the trainers, who will then go back at the national level to try and provide that training. But the needs are great, and we are seeing, because of the routes changing very much, that when new routes open up, we have a whole new set of national actors who may need training. So it's a very dynamic process. And there was a question just on the issue of return. Maybe again that might be my colleague from IOM may wish to address that also. But I think one thing to make clear, we do not envisage return to Syria at the moment. I mean, return is something that we would like to see in an assisted voluntary capacity, where the conditions are correct, where it is appropriate and possible to return people on a voluntary basis, and certainly the UNHCR advice at the moment is it's not safe to return people to Syria because of the situation that's pertaining there, and that's very much reflected in the high recognition rate for Syrians in the European Union. I think I've covered most of the ones that fell clearly within the UNHCR mandate, but I'm open to answering any further questions people may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the answers. Laura?
Thank you very much, Laura. You have the floor.
Well, let me try to address the various questions without repeating myself a lot. Well, I think first of all there was your question about the difference between asylum seekers and the rest, and I think that my colleague from UNHCR has responded to that very well, but let's be extremely clear about that. Refugee is a special legal status that is granted by an international convention, and that special legal status is or generates a series of obligations of countries that have signed and ratified the convention and the protocol of 67. Whereas migrants are everybody else that does not fall within that convention. We always said that refugees are migrants too, but they are protected by a specific convention, and that specific convention again gives us a series of protection measures to them. One of the problems that the international system has, and very often it's what produces exactly the overload of the refugee and the asylum seeker processes, is that the difference between being a refugee and an irregular migrant are such that everybody tries to ask for asylum seeker, try to ask for asylum, because obviously, and I would do the same. I mean, there is no doubt that if I had the possibility to try to pass by a potential asylum seeker, then everybody will do the request. And that is part of the problem of the difference, the big difference between the two status. Is this good for migrants? Certainly not. Is this good for refugees? I don't think that is good for refugees neither, because the reality is that at the end of the day, what it happens is that it puts a lot of pressure into the system, into the processing systems for refugees, and it delays a lot of and very often the systems crash. And that has happened also in Europe with these arrivals. So, but that's a reality, and that reality, unfortunately, we cannot address it. There are two systems, and those two systems are different and involve different levels of protection and completely different rights. somebody asked, and sorry because I lost a little bit of the location of the people that did the questions. Somebody asked about the effects of bombardments and displacement. Well, certainly there is an effect. I mean, there is no doubt that when people are bombed and cities are bombed, people move around from those cities. I am not saying that that is wrong or is not wrong, but there is a natural result, that is that people will move around from those places, and certainly that will clear further displacement. Identification is always a challenge. It's always a challenge because part of the tactics of being an irregular migrant is to not have identification. That facilitates the whole process of irregularity. So it's always a challenge. Training and education is fundamental. We also, as UNHCR does, we train not only the civil society organizations that work, some of the associations that work with migrants, but in addition to that, we train our people constantly. We train other organizations. We train governments, and certainly it's a non-stop exercise. A package of responses, there was a question about the package of responses to this situation, certainly. And part of, I think, what Michael explained in his presentation is what Valletta did and the plan of action of Valletta, the trust fund, and how that involves a series of elements that are part of a more holistic, let's put it this way, attempt to respond to this situation, not only from the European Union perspective, but also from the perspective of the other countries, of the African countries that were participating. So it has, let's put it this way, obligations and attempts to respond from both sides, which I think are extremely important. Pull factors. And the question was, are we going to have an enormous flow of migrants? Well, I honestly, I hope we would. That means growth, economic growth, a lot of employment opportunities, and probably a much better financial situation in Europe. Migrants are very knowledgeable about the conditions. I always said, it doesn't sound very nice, but migrants are really not stupid. They go where the jobs are. And the perfect example is Spain. From 2000 to 2010, we had a large influx of migrants to Spain. Huge.
More than 4 million.
More than 4 million. Okay. And then there was one day that there had something happened that was called the financial crisis and economic crisis in Spain. That same year, migration stopped to Spain. I mean, it was not that nobody went to Spain that day, but the big flow of migrants stopped immediately because they knew that there were no job opportunities anymore in Spain. And actually, migrants started to go back from Spain to their countries of origin. Not to mention that some Spanish also started to go into the opposite direction looking for jobs. But the reality is that, and we talked about that before, migration is like water. It goes where there are opportunities, and it doesn't go where there is no opportunities. So I think I don't think that we are going to have enormous flow of migrants, because the reality is that the economic conditions in Europe today do not invite for large flows of migrants in the future. But as long as there are jobs in Europe that are not fulfilled by the local population, as long as there are specific needs in labor markets, and as long as there is an informal economic sector in Europe that is very often offering really bad conditions to migrants, but nonetheless is hiring people in irregular conditions, you will have not only flows, but you will have irregular flows, because that informal economic sector, that is what they are using. Those irregular flows that they know that they can hire in much lower conditions than what the normal markets are. And part of it, and part of the response to that is opening the legal channels. Because again, if there is need, there will be people that will come. If there are no legal channels, they will use irregular channels to arrive to the places, and they will be more susceptible to abuse and exploitation in the countries. Is return of these people realistic today? Well, I certainly agree with my colleague of UNHCR that to Syria, no. There are some, and my organization does a large number of the assisted voluntary returns of migrants that are in irregular condition very often, the majority of them, or that are failed asylum seekers back to their countries of origin. But we have several conditions for doing that, and one very clear condition is that the countries where they are going to return have to be in a situation that can absorb, again, these people from the minimum requirements. It's not necessarily the economic requirements, and that's why we very often push for also packages of reintegration for these people so that they economically get a little bit of help in order to be reintegrated, and that we don't basically promote a vicious circle of people going back home and waiting another year to come back again and try again and do this constantly. So we promote the packages of reintegration so that these people find a different situation, let's put it this way, of what made them left originally the country. But obviously the reintegration packages very often require additional funding the majority of the time, and as a result of that, they are not always available. But there are some political conditions that are required, and certainly Syria today does not present those conditions. I have to cut my responses according to the chair. Just two or three more. Okay. Climate, political and economic refugees. Well, first of all, there are political refugees. They are not economic refugees. Those are migrants. They are not refugees because refugee is a legal category again. And climate refugees, well, there has been a lot of discussion whether we have climate refugees or not. And there is a lot of reluctance to call people that move because of climatic conditions or degradation, environmental degradation, refugees. And there has been discussions about that. I think there is a broader consensus moving towards environmental migrants than refugees because, again, refugee is a specific legal status that is given by a specific international agreement, and that does not include these people. One more minute. Proportions of refugees and migrants, 250 international migrants, 60 refugees and internally displaced persons, 19.5 refugees, so the rest are migrants. I was asked about the key argument to change this from a challenge to an opportunity. And I very briefly would say demographic needs, labor market needs, research and innovation needs, and basically, does Europe want to live in the 21st century or do you want to really live in the 20th century? The young people that are behind there. Are you going to be asking jobs only around the corner of your house, or are you really in the global market? And if you ask me, I think that the majority of you are going to be looking for jobs in the global market. And that global market requires opening of everybody. It's not only of the others, but opening of everybody so that people will move around finding jobs for the future. And the last point, Mr. Chair, because you are looking at me with aggressive eyes.
No, you have to you have to keep some questions for the dinner.
The dinner. Okay.
Because you will get the speaker, but you can.
Public opinion on the member states, and I think that this is a key point. And again, if you would ask me what is the most difficult job of your organization, is changing that perception. And why? Because of this discussion. Because what we discuss here is the problem of migration, because what we discuss this is the challenge that Europe is facing, because of exactly the type of discussion that we have very often. And we don't see the other side that I was trying to pass to you today and really convince you that there is another side. But that other side doesn't come out in the news because successful stories that are millions of successful stories of migrants that have made huge contributions to the development of countries, huge investments, created big companies, those are not in the news. So the first thing that we have to talk about is how do we make the media engage into a different dialogue about migration. And if you find magic solutions, please let me know, because we, for the moment, have not managed to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Laura.